Hi, good afternoon. My name is Jay Rothman, and welcome to a special edition of Real Men, Real Talk Raw, brought to you by Spirituality Gone Wild. Today, it is an unusual day for me. I usually don't broadcast on Tuesday afternoons, especially at 1:30 West Coast time. However, an opportunity arose. I have a special guest on this afternoon. His name is Michael Cameron. And I'd like to welcome Michael to the studio and invite him to open it up and share a little bit about his story. But before we go there, I just want to express my gratitude to Debs, who is a friend of mine in my Facebook community, who actually had reached out to me. She had viewed a number of my shows and said, "I've got this gentleman that you have to meet. He is someone that has to be on your show." And so what happened was she sent me some links to information on you, and I got educated. I learned more about your background, about your story, and I immediately reached out to you. And this is about a month and a half or so ago. And so fast forward, I just want to share this little tidbit because this was so important to me. It's very rare that I see your Facebook feed pop up on my feed. Very rare. But it popped up this morning. And what it was acknowledging that today is a 3-year anniversary of the murder of Colleen, your girlfriend. And it just hit me. I was like, in that moment, I just felt it, And it wasn't more than 10 minutes, at most 15, that I get a private message from you saying to me, "Okay, I'm kind of, trying to figure out when you could come on, either Friday or Sunday." And what happened was you said to me, "Today's the anniversary of Colleen's murder." And I took the day off. And so if you're available, I could do the show today. And my first instinct I said to you, I believe, was, I've got a show at 6 o'clock. And I don't know that I'm going to have the energy to do both because I'm on the 18th day of my water fast. And after I said that, wisdom came from within. And I was just like, there's no way I could say no to you. This is an important day in your life, a day to acknowledge something very significant. And I was like, I just can't say no. There's a reason why you showed up today on my Facebook feed and then in a private message. And so here we are. Of course, I said yes. And so without further ado, Michael, welcome to the show. I am honored and privileged to have you on.
Thanks, Jay. I'm thrilled to be here. Today is a very special day for me, and everybody tends to want to, and I'll tell my sort of the full story in a minute, but everybody sort of tends to want to send condolences and thoughts, sort of somber thoughts today. And honestly, for me, Colleen was somebody that loved life, and so I really try to make today a celebration, more than a sad day. And an opportunity to share a very strong message that needs to get out there. And I love hearing that there are shows out there like yours having this conversation, because I think, historically we've lacked that. And honestly, that's, in my opinion, that's part of the reason why Colleen is not here today. So if you want, I'm happy to go back and sort of share the entire story. Or do you have questions? Do you want to drive traffic, or?
Michael, I'm going to let you share, and I will ask questions when it feels appropriate. But I'm just allowing you to just share as much as you would like on the back end of the story, as well as then kind of bring us to today. what's
Yeah.
transpired from then till now, because 3 years has in fact come and gone. So
Yeah. Okay. Absolutely. Yeah. It was. Yeah. Three years ago today, my girlfriend Colleen spent the night at my place on a what was a Thursday night, and Friday morning, Colleen taught yoga at 6 o'clock in the morning. So she got up at a little after 5 o'clock in the morning and came over, gave me a kiss, and said goodbye. And I said, have fun at yoga, and rolled over and went back to sleep. And got up around, I don't know, 6:30 or so, went downstairs to make breakfast, shot her a text a little after 7, as was kind of our custom, and didn't get a response back. And I thought, not completely uncommon. Colleen, she wasn't a huge talker, but she was an amazing listener, and as a result, often got drawn into fairly lengthy conversations after a yoga class. So, I had a 9 o'clock appointment for work, so I went downtown for my 9 o'clock. Still hadn't heard back from her. Was starting to get a little bit concerned. Sent her another text. Gave her a phone call. Got voicemail. Long story short, I ended up back at my office where I had an 11 o'clock appointment, and shot her a text and said, "Hey, let me know you're all right. I'm starting to get a little bit worried about you. I haven't heard from you now. It's like I said, typically we would touch base shortly after 7 a.m. And I wrapped up my 11 o'clock, and we decided to go across the street for lunch to sort of celebrate. We had just come to an agreement on a business transaction, and as the hostess was about to seat us at the restaurant, my phone rang, and I looked at it, and it was a blocked number, and I answered the call, and the voice on the other end said, "Is this Mike Cameron?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "This is Constable so-and-so," and I don't remember his name, and my heart just sank, and I immediately said, "Is she okay?" And he says, "Where are you?" I said, "Is she okay?" And he says, "Where are you?" "We're at your house. We're coming to you." And so I told him where I was, and hung up the phone, and turned and walked out of the restaurant. I don't think I said even 2 words to my guests. I walked outside, and I waited at the curb, and it was maybe 5 minutes later, and an unmarked police car pulled up across the street, and this big badass looking cop with a gun on his hip and plainclothes badge around his neck gets out, and I start crossing the street, and he met me in the middle of the street, and he looked me in the eye, and he said 3 words to me that would change my life forever. He simply stated, "Colleen is dead." Shot and killed by an ex-boyfriend who subsequently took his own life. And as a guy that lives in sort of a upper middle class neighborhood, this kind of stuff doesn't happen to me. So it was again, it was so surreal sitting in the back of that police car, and all I kept doing was saying, "This can't be real. This can't be real." And it wasn't until, of course, they were asking me a bunch of questions, and I still really didn't know what had transpired. All I knew was that she was gone, and of course, so I've got all kinds of things racing through my head at that point. My kids, her kids, who's okay, what's going on. And it wasn't until they handed me the business card of victim services that it sort of sunk in. And I realized what had happened. And, obviously, that was a bit of a game changer for me. So this was a guy that had been a problem in the past, and Colleen had done all the right things, had filed all the right paperwork, had the right restraining order, had the protective order in place. In fact, had he even breached the protective order, she had, filed that. They slapped him with, I think he got a $500 fine for that. And of course, when that happened, there was so many people that sort of wanted me to rally against the justice system, which surely had failed her. But when I looked at it, I thought, trying to build a better restraining order or trying to build a better protective order is akin to putting a Band-Aid on a ruptured jugular. That's really not solving the problem. So, when I looked at the root cause, I thought, how do we prevent men like this from existing in the first place? And a lot of it is just having this conversation, Jay. Like the fact that you have a show like this to allow men to have the conversation, it really makes me wonder if, sorry, I wrestle with his name. If Paul had an outlet to have these kinds of conversations, years before, would that have changed the trajectory of his path and therefore Colleen's? So, again, to me, if I'm going to spend energy trying to change something, it's not going to be about changing the justice system. I mean, granted, that needs to change. There's definitely things that need to change, but I'll leave that for others. So for my money, it's about having these kinds of conversations with good men like you, because I got to believe there's more good men out there than bad. The problem historically has been us good men have been too freaking quiet. So it's time to change that. And that's kind of been my journey. I've been speaking professionally for well over a decade. So I've got a voice. I've got a story, and it's time to share it. So I can't change what's happened in the past, but my hope is that I can prevent this from happening in the future to somebody else, which is why I share the story.
Michael, thank you. Thank you so much for sharing, what happened 3 years ago. I honor you and I honor Colleen in this moment.
Thank you.
One of the things, the only thing I really resonates with me big time is when you said you wanted to look at the root, because typically when a story like this unfolds, and of course, this is not the first one, we hear this story all the time, probably daily. I don't know what the statistics are annually, but it's significant enough. The justice system isn't working when it comes to domestic violence and restraining orders. It just doesn't work. But I really, really can appreciate the fact that you had the awareness to look at this on a much more deeper level. And instead of going after the justice system and perhaps using that as like I want to use the word vendetta, but your motivation to make change in the justice system, I think you took a much more profound, deeper perspective on this problem and understanding that truly the justice system can be improved, as you said, but that's not really the root cause, as you also described, is that we have a problem when it comes to how men express or don't express their emotions. They don't feel safe to. A lot of them, I'm using a general term, they, we, but we are a we, it's not a they. But I wonder, how do you think you have been able to impact change where do you think the problem stems with us as a mass, and what have you done to impact change in the last 3 years?
So a couple of things I think have come of this. One, having the conversation, and sort of taking it out of the back room and hiding it has allowed others to come forward. So I've certainly had a number of different, private messages and been contacted by other individuals that have been impacted by similar circumstances that, again, there's a lot of shame and guilt that go along with the victims in these cases. So that's sort of one piece of it. The other, for me, I've had the opportunity to share the story with, in a lot of different venues, universities all across North America, and really get in front of some young adults. So, I also had the opportunity to speak on the TEDx stage as well, and I talk about what I call redefining badass, and there's a bit of a story that goes with that. But Jay, I feel like, and it's been a long time since I could say this without absolutely falling apart, and I don't know why this chokes me up every time, but I feel like everything I have done for the last, for the 46 years of my life leading up to when she was killed had prepared me for that moment. As you say, I had the ability to look at this maybe a little differently than some others might. And, a lot of that sort of comes back to, my experience in business and sales. For over 2 decades, I've studied the impact that emotion has on human behavior. I've studied it in my sales career. As a sales guy, we're taught early that people buy on emotion justified by logic. So how do we make that emotional connection with our prospects, our clients? As a business leader, I recognized very early on that my staff productivity was directly linked to emotion. And, so I learned to sort of navigate some of those waters. And, I spent a lot of time and energy researching and studying emotional intelligence. And then, of course, with what happened to Colleen, clearly this is a man that made a decision based on emotion. He made a decision with very permanent consequences based on a very temporary emotion. And, I wrote an article probably maybe close to 5 years ago now, entitled "Men, It's Time to Woman Up." And I talk about, just the perils with this whole man up culture. And the fact that as men, we're not allowed to explore our emotions and the perils that creates. I mean, if we don't understand the underlying emotions that drive the decisions we make, we have zero chance of living a fully awakened existence. So, that's the message that I put out there. And, unfortunately, coupled with a powerful story, it's impactful. So, that's what I've been doing for the last 3 years. When Colleen was first killed, I sort of reached out and started having conversations with a number of different organizations. I met with, the Justice Minister. We have a Minister of the Status of Women here in Alberta, and just started having conversations with, whoever I could to find out where I can help. Mary says, how can you ever be prepared? And you're right, you can't. And I mean, that's something else I talk about often. Again, I wrote a piece a number of years before Colleen was killed called "Embrace the Suck," where I talk about, I do endurance sports. So I do Ironman triathlon, ultra marathons, that kind of thing. And one of my favorite triathletes is a fellow by the name of Chris McCormick. And he had written an article entitled Embrace the Suck, where he'd sort of taken that military term and applied it to triathlon. And for him, he moved from short course triathlon to long course triathlon. And he talked about the fact that it doesn't matter how much you train in triathlon, no amount of preparation is going to get you to a point where you can avoid the inevitable suck that hits you at some point in that, in an Ironman race. At some point, that race is going to suck. And there's just no amount of training you can do to avoid that. So rather than train to avoid the suck, train to embrace the suck. And it was interesting because I rewrote that article, shortly after Colleen was killed, and I was forced to, embrace the suck on a whole different level. And there was, like you talked about today, there's just these little series of events that bring us to places. And the reason you and I have connected here today, I had much similar circumstances when Colleen was killed. Are you familiar with A Letter to Rachel by Ram Dass?
No, I'm not.
Do you know who Ram Dass is?
No.
Ram Dass was an American spiritual leader in the 70s. And a yogi friend of mine out of Montreal shared this letter with me maybe 2 days after Colleen was killed. And honestly, Jay, that letter changed my life without exaggeration. Ram Dass had written a letter to the parents of a young girl who had been brutally murdered. And in that letter, I mean, it's short. Your audience can Google it. It's maybe 5 paragraphs in it, but I've probably read it 200 times since then. And there was kind of 3 things that stuck out at me there. In that letter, he talks about who among us would be strong enough to remain conscious through such teachings as you are receiving? Probably very few. And when I read that, I realized that I had a choice. I could, curl up into a little ball and wither away, or I could stay awake and feel what I was feeling fully, embrace it, explore it, observe it, and move through it. That was, again, that was such a game changer for me. When you can sort of change perspective, and I think we talked about this a little bit earlier off air when we were talking. I can't change what's happened, but if I can look at this, this was an opportunity to feel something that many people will never feel. So to tune that out and numb that was just not something I wanted to do. So I really sort of embraced the teachings, the learnings, and looked for the lessons in this. So that was kind of the first thing that came out of that letter. The other thing that he talked about was now is the time to let your grief find expression, no false strength. And again, that one spoke to me as well, because as men, we're taught to suck it up. Don't be a pussy, and for me, it was really about allowing myself to grieve and allowing that grief to find expression. And as a speaker, this is the way I do that. And the third piece in that letter that resonated with me, he talked about our rational minds can never understand what has happened, but our hearts, if we keep them open, can find their own intuitive way. And again, that was kind of that letting go of the why question, because that's what we always inevitably ask, right? Why did this happen to Colleen? She was one of the most wonderful women you'll ever meet. Why? There's no rational explanation for it.
One of the things I'd like to go back a little bit is when we talk about how do we affect change. by the outcome, by what's transpired. And one of the things that I'm passionate about today is we have to start at a very young age. We're a lot of us are taught in homes, as you just described, suck it up, be a man, right? Don't be a pussy, as you described it. Real men don't cry. And I've actually blogged about that topic. I've talked about it a number of times. But I think the problem is, the challenge is just not in a home. It's a belief system that at least the North American society has about little boys that become adult boys and men, and how we're supposed to behave. And the sad thing is that not only are we taught that in our homes, in a lot of homes, the majority, but then we go to a school system, and the school systems are not focused on life skills. They're focused on academics, so that because the academics lead us to the idea of a career and making money and following the North American dream. And I'm saying North American because I want to respect the fact that you are a Canadian citizen. Yeah. And so with all due respect, and therein lies, I think, part of the root problem right there is that we're not taught life skills in the public educational system. We're not really taught life skills in home. A lot of our parents are chasing a dream, chasing the external, and they're either paying babysitters, nannies, childcare centers to spend the majority of time raising the kids. And so where do these life lessons come in? Where do these life skills? Where do we teach these young boys that we have as a male, we have the male and the female within us. And it's okay to let the female out. It's okay to feel. It's okay to express how we are feeling. It's okay to be our authentic selves. We don't have to pretend to be something that we may not be because we're not. We have both the male and the female, yet we are taught otherwise. And the sad thing about that is the majority of women that I've met in my lifetime, and I continue to meet through my community, through social media, and through my travels and doings, is most, there's not a woman out there, if they're looking to be in a relationship, whether it be with a partner or a friend, that doesn't want a male to just be vulnerable and authentic. It's what women want, yet, and so many men struggle with providing that. And their answer is, well, this is just who I am. This is just how I am. We hear that. I do life coaching. I've done life coaching now for a couple of years, relationship coaching, and time again, that's what my female clients share with me. Is like, my husband's like, this is who I am. Like, take it or leave it. And it's just so sad because ultimately, as a male, we want the same things women want. We want to love. We want to be loved. Yes. Yet it's like we're lacking, where a lot of us are lacking in the ability to understand truly what women want is for us to just be who we authentically are. Yet we've got this old belief system that's been taught to us by our parents, that's been handed down from generation to generation, ancestrally speaking, and it's not working. It hasn't worked. There's a reason why the divorce rate in our country is so high in the United States. I don't know what it is in Canada, but it's beyond comprehensible that we as a society has not figured out what the root cause of the divorce rate being so high. And I think a large part of it is that we're not willing to just be who we are and yes. feel safe to be that, because we're afraid of ridicule. Because that's what happened to a lot of us as young boys. we're ridiculed in our own homes for not being strong.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and again, I think just having this conversation, like I said, I've traveled all over North America and had some version of this conversation, from stage. And everywhere I go, I mean, there is a universal truth. And I can say this, men everywhere are literally dying for somebody to give them permission to feel. You look at the suicide rates in men, it's ridiculous. And I believe that a lot of that comes back to the not being able to process emotions. And it's because we've been taught since we were in diapers to ignore them, to put them away, to stuff them way down deep somewhere, hide them away. And that causes huge troubles. Again, like I said, in my instance, it manifested with Paul killing Colleen. And it makes me wonder what that outcome would have been for him as an individual. If he could have had those conversations as he was growing up. Again, I know nothing about his background, but it just makes me wonder. And for me, it starts at home. I've got a 17. My boy will be 18 in October. I've got a soon to be 16-year-old girl. So for me, it starts at home. And extending out the conversation. And to your point, I mean, the school systems, we need to get there as well. And I've been fortunate. I've had the opportunity to speak at a lot of university levels. I'm actually going up to a community here in Alberta in November. They've hired me to come in and speak to the high schools, a couple of the different high schools there as well, and have this conversation there. So, I do believe it's starting to change, but we need to keep pushing.
So it's basically it's a grassroots effort.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's just touching one person at a time, and that's I admire you for that, for putting yourself out there, and becoming an advocate for speaking and allowing your voice to be heard wherever you are invited and welcome to do just that. A question that's come in is, how has Colleen's children done? You mentioned she had children.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, they're doing all right. Their father is still around, so I'm not very connected anymore. But yeah, I mean, they're surviving. I certainly wasn't the one that was most significantly impacted out of all of this. I mean, she's got a 25-year-old son as well. So we need to keep having that conversation.
You said that you're not as connected with the kids. When you and Colleen were together, and how long had you been together at that point?
Yeah, we were only together for 5 months.
Okay. So you had probably not had the opportunity to really get to know our children too well at that point.
No, we weren't that connected.
Okay. Well, for you, that may have been somewhat of a blessing, because otherwise it would have been kind of like another loss.
Yes.
If not, that may be a blessing. One of the things that you and I chatted about this morning was about forgiveness.
Yes.
And I shared with you a quote that one of my mentors, Jay Shetty, in his Private Genius community, has shared with us. He did a whole month on forgiveness, a whole 1 month of the topic was on forgiveness. And one of the things he said is, forgiveness is the apology we never get.
Yeah.
And I shared that with you this morning. And I'd like for you to just expand a little bit about what that process looked like for you. And I'll let you share the story, but the question is, have you forgiven, have you not? And how did you get to where you're at today?
Yeah, I mean, I think, for me, that was probably the hardest thing I've ever had to do in my life. When I split up with my ex-wife and I had to tell our kids that we were going to live in separate homes and split, I thought, that was probably the most challenging thing I've ever had to do. And then, of course, when Colleen was killed, I figured that was probably the most challenging thing I was ever going to encounter. But shortly after Colleen was killed, and again, I'm one that doesn't ignore signs, fate, destiny, the universe, call it what you will. But I had about 3 people share with me a parable called The Little Soul in the Sun. I don't know if you're familiar with it. It's been a while since I read it, so I won't do it justice, but basically it's a little soul talking to God, and he's talking about what he wants to be, or what he wants to experience, and God says, well, you can experience anything you want, and he says, well, I want to experience forgiveness. And God says, well, that's wonderful. The problem is I've made everybody, all of the other souls around you are perfect, so there's nobody to forgive. And by this time, all the other little souls had sort of crowded around and were listening to this conversation, and one of the little souls puts his hand up and says to the little soul, I will go to Earth and I will do something so terrible that you will have to forgive. And the little soul, of course, says, well, why would you give up your perfection just in order to allow me to have something to forgive? And of course, the soul said, because he loves you. Anyways, again, I don't do it justice at all. It's worth reading. It's not a long one. But when I read that, I absolutely fell apart, and I realized what I had to do. And as we discussed, I mean, forgiveness is not for the other person. I could hold on to anger, I could hold on to hate. I'd certainly be justified to do that. This is a man that killed the woman I loved. But that doesn't serve anybody. So, I really had to come to terms with the fact that I had to do that for me. And I don't know that it's a one-shot deal. I kind of feel like it's something, you might, depending on your circumstance, maybe you have to wake up every day and do it all over again. Depending where you're at in your journey. And I don't know if it's easier for me because he took his own life. Would it be as easy if he were still alive? I don't know. But it's certainly something I think about very frequently.
What is it that you think about very frequently? If it would be different if he was alive?
No, just the what was taken, and the fact that I have to let that go, that I have to forgive, and that it is for me. And again, we accomplish more with love than with hate. So there's absolutely zero purpose to hanging on to that hate and bitterness. Again, it all comes back to choice. You've always got a choice. Some choices are easier than others. You can choose to hate, but what does that serve? It serves nothing. So I always look at it, anytime I'm feeling in any circumstance, whether I'm feeling angry or somebody's wronged me, and a lot of times we're justified in being angry and hateful, but being justified doesn't make it any more useful. So if I want to impact the world, am I best served by hanging on to that bitterness and hate? And the answer is clearly no. And it comes back to practice. You know, I talk about that a lot in any of my, I speak a lot on sales and leadership as well. And when I talk to a group of salespeople, I always tell them, I don't want you to try anything that I've told you today. I want you to practice everything that I've told you today. So it really comes back to a daily practice. And anybody that, practices yoga, meditation, you're familiar with the concept to some extent. But, when we try something, it leaves us open to failure. Oh, I tried that, didn't work, I'm done. When we practice something, it's just about getting better each and every time. You don't expect to be perfect. You expect that today I practiced. Tomorrow I'll practice again and again and again and again and again. And for me, forgiveness is a practice. It's not a thing. It's a practice.
I'm taking it in. I love that. You hit on two things. One is, the forgiveness part, and the second part is daily practices. Some people refer to them as daily rituals. It's something that I had never done in my lifetime until I hit my rock bottom. And I understood that the only way that I was going to stay alive, and not just live, but really live, was I had to change every aspect of my own life. And that included, I had to start to learn how to take care of myself through daily practices, daily rituals, if I may. And I had to be very consistent with it, no matter how I felt. And I was battling recovery after some major surgeries that, unfortunately, I had some side effects that took me out for about 1.5 years of extreme fatigue. And there were so many days where I knew that if the only thing I got accomplished that day was my daily practice, and that was it, and that was going to be good enough.
Right.
That was all that mattered. That I had to first take care of me before I could take care of anything or anybody else. And it was through those daily practices that it almost became an addiction for me, a healthy one for the first time in my life. Because I had a lot of unhealthy addictions. Believe me, I had them. But it's a beautiful thing once you start to experience the benefits of getting into the routine of daily practices, first taking care of yourself. I also love when you refer to, I'll try. And I'm with you all the way. I mean, try isn't out. You're not committing to it. You basically say, hey, I'll give it a shot, but it's the out, because if it doesn't work, well, at least I tried.
Yeah.
And that doesn't work in my life anymore. It's either I'm committed to doing something or I'm not. There's no in between anymore. If it doesn't feel right, I don't. But if it feels right, then I got to give it my all, and then turn it over to a higher power. Some people refer to God, for the outcomes to turn out the way they're intended, not necessarily the way I want them to. Going back to forgiveness, that's such a slippery slope. And as I'm listening to you speak, one of the things that's got to be, I would suspect, somewhat challenging for you, Michael, is when you're out there and you're speaking. Now, I know today may be an unusual day because it's today, 3 years ago today is when Colleen was murdered. But each time you share the story, each time you share what happened, it brings you right back to that day. And one of the challenges that I had to learn how to do was to let go of my past and not keep retelling the same story, because every time I share the old stuff, it emotionally, mentally, and physically can bring me back there. And that's, I don't know, for me, I had my moment where, my clarity, where I realized that I've got to start living in the moment. I got to let go of that, the stuff, the past wounds and traumas that impacted me, and start living in just today.
Right.
How do you do that as an individual that's on a stomping ground doing the work you're doing?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I'm not sure I've ever really addressed that before, but that's a great question, and I think, for me, and people ask me this all the time, but I think it's because I've been able to come to peace with what's happened. Yes, emotionally, I still find to share the story publicly, it definitely takes a toll, but it's almost, and I do this from time to time as well. There's certain songs, of course, that I'll play, and I'll just take a moment, and I was doing that earlier today, and I just sit and I'll cry and remember, and it's not about hanging on to the past. It's about remembering and celebrating what was, in an effort to appreciate what is. And I met a beautiful woman about a little over a year ago, who I'm very much in love with. And so, again, celebrating today, which sounds funny, but I can't remember if we talked about this on air or off air, but, I really feel like today should be a celebration of who Colleen was. And, she was one that was very present focused. So for me, going back there really brings up a lot of, she taught me so much. I learned so much from her. She was a yogi. Just her air of calm, who she was so powerful, that it's not about hanging on to something that was horrible. It's about celebrating the lessons learned and honoring who she was and continues to be. So, again, people ask me, well, when I put on the headphones and I put on, Ed Sheeran's Photograph, we went to the Ed Sheeran concert together, and that was, a big moment in our relationship. So when I listen to that song, it always takes me back, and I'll just sit there and weep. And people ask me, well, why do you do that to yourself? And it just, for me, it's like having coffee with an old friend. If that makes any sense. I don't know.
It makes all the sense in the world, Michael. I embraced music as a form of therapeutic, part of my ritual, my daily practice. Every day I have my music on while I'm in the middle of my practices, and it's actually part of the healing process. Mm-hmm. So I totally get that, and I love the fact that you recognize the powerful tool that music can be. Not everybody does, but it's another one of those gifts that we're given, and keeps coming at us. We have about 10 minutes left in the show. I do want to do a couple of things. First off, I have not welcomed the community, those that have joined us this afternoon. I know it's the middle of a work day for many of you. If you're live, if you're here, I know you've got a lot of comments and a few questions. Michael and I will spend some time after the show in the next couple hours, or whatever time you can, Michael. Even if it's tomorrow, you can come back and kind of go through the questions or comments and reply. I wanted to take this time today just to really dedicate the show to you and your story, and not have too much comments and questions that we're addressing. But what time we do have left, oh, and if you didn't make the live, it's okay, because this is on replay. It'll be posted on Facebook, and it'll be there for as long as you are on Facebook. So thank you for joining the show in the community. With the time we have left, Michael, I'd like you to expand a little bit about the work that you are, I believe you're involved in today with domestic abuse, or share a little bit about that, if you may.
Sure. Well, there's a couple of different areas that I work in. Like I said, with a lot of it is just sharing the story. I'm a runner, as I mentioned, so I founded a run, the Ignore No More Run for Respect, which we started last year. So actually this past Sunday was our second annual run, and we do it really just to, again, a lot of this is about meeting men where they live, so to speak, right? And so bringing the run community together to have this kind of conversation, I think it is key. And again, the amount of men that will open up and have some of this conversation has just been phenomenal. We also raise funds. There's an organization called Stop Abuse in Families. They provide counseling services for individuals, men and women, that have had to flee abusive situations. So I do a lot of work there. I've worked with the city of Edmonton on some of their initiatives. You know, they have a whole department around family violence prevention. November in I don't know if it's international, but November is Family Violence Prevention Month. So I kind of get around during that time and share the story and do what I can to spread the message. So again, I think a lot of this for me is really about turning pain into purpose. How do we, the story, I don't think I've told you the Make Beautiful Shit Happen story. I hope I can swear on your podcast or on your show. Colleen and I used to talk a lot about, we used to talk a lot of philosophy, and one of the conversations we had was around the subject of talent. And I remember asking her what her talent was, and she said, I make things beautiful, which she absolutely did. She was an artist, a painter, a photographer, a videographer. She had a real knack for finding the beauty in everything. And she turned it around and she said, well, what do you think your talent is? And I kind of hummed and hawed, and I said, not to take away, because by all sort of standard measures, I've been successful, but I'm not sure that there's any one particular thing that I'm exceptionally gifted at or a particular talent that I have. So I turned it around and I said, well, what do you think my talent is? And she said, oh, that's easy. You've got a much more useful talent. I said, oh, what's that? She said, you make shit happen. I went, as a business guy, I kind of like that. So there you had it, Jay. She made things beautiful. I made shit happen. Together, we were going to make beautiful shit happen. So for me, I vowed that day on her driveway, her story would not end there, and that I would continue to do what I could do to make beautiful shit happen in her name.
That is just so beautiful, Michael. What a beautiful way to honor her and honor your relationship. I want to just give you a few more minutes here to ask you, on your TED Talk, your TED Talk was about redefining badass.
Yes.
So I'd like to invite you to just spend a few moments here redefining what does badass mean to you today.
Sure. Well, so again, to back up, so I told you I've done Ironman, I run a business, I did yoga. Colleen was an avid rock climber, so she got me into rock climbing. I'm an ice climber. I guess I overcompensate for a lot of things from my childhood, but it prompted a lot of good-natured teasing from Colleen about how badass I was. And when we were in Penticton, BC, in Canada, for a race that I was running, an iron distance race, and I'll keep this short, but my 65-year-old aunt ended up having us over for dinner, and she was telling us a story about how, again, you kind of got to get the picture of Aunt Sharon. She's 65 years old, not overly fit, might even say a little bit overweight. So she's telling us a story about how she decided she wanted to get a little bit more active, wanted to get a little bit more fit, and had decided to sign up for the 5K fun run leading up to the event that I did. And so she's telling us this story. She goes, I knew full well I was going to be dead last. And there I was. I lined up at the very back. The gun went off. We took off. I get about a kilometer and a half away from the finish line. And all of a sudden, this kid on a bike starts riding beside me. And I looked over at him and I said, you're here because I'm last, aren't you? And he says, yep, I'm afraid so. But you're doing great. You're doing great. And he's cheering her in. And she says they get within about 100 meters of the finish line. And he says, okay, well, I'm going to ride ahead and let him know you're still out on course. So she's like, oh, no. And she's telling us this story over dinner. So he rides ahead. She looks up and she could see that she is so far last that they've already started tearing down the finish line. They've already started packing up the PA system. And when he gets there, of course, they pull everything back out again. And they send Jeff Simons, who's a professional triathlete, out to run in with her. Anyway, she finishes telling us this story. She gets up from dinner to clear the table, goes into the kitchen, and Colleen just looks at me. And she says, you know what, Mike? She goes, now that's fucking badass. And I just, at that moment, we had a 10.5-hour drive home after that trip. And the entire drive, we talked about what does it really mean to be a badass. And we happened to be listening to the Tim Ferriss podcast. And he had Brene Brown on. And at one point, he asked her about, what do you think of the over-feminization of boys in our school systems? Which I kind of went, huh? But she handled it brilliantly. And she talked about, what you touched on. Masculine and feminine aren't mutually exclusive. And in fact, she said, I believe that perfect combination of tough and tender is the exact equation for badassery. So boom, that kind of wrapped it all up for me. And again, I have lots of stories around that, but I was doing a sales presentation. I had a proposal to put in for a sales presentation at a large national conference in the brokering community, and Colleen had said to me, you should call it badass brokering. And I kind of went, that's a little edgy. I'm not sure these guys are ready for that. And she said, look, dude, part of your presentation is about being authentic. This is totally you. You need to send it in. So I sent it in with the title Badass Brokering. And probably 5 minutes after I sent that email in, the event organizer emailed me back and she says, oh my goodness. She goes, this is by far the best title we've ever seen. I can't tell you got the gig, but I'm pretty sure you got the gig. So that presentation went that proposal went in September. Colleen was killed October 2nd. The presentation was actually November 15th-ish. So I completely rewrote the presentation to include this story that I just shared with you and bring it home. So for me, the whole redefining what it means to be a badass is a big part of that conversation. And really, as we discussed, it's about embracing that feminine side of yourself, finding that perfect balance of head and heart, that perfect combination of tough and tender. And in my opinion, that's what makes a badass.
I love it. I love it. Michael, I want to thank you for joining the show. I'm going to just leave it at that because I just love who you are. I love the man that you are today. I feel you're a badass coming through very, very, very clearly. And you are an inspiration, I'm sure, to a lot of men that have been willing to come out and feel safe enough to start being who they are, coming home to themselves. And I want to thank you for joining this live broadcast on Facebook Live, on the Spirituality Gone Wild channel today. I want to again honor you for showing up and honor you for sharing a story about honoring today's the date of Colleen's death. And I'd love to stay close to you and maybe have you back on in the future, maybe check in, see how things are coming along on your advocacy work and the work you're doing out there to help educate people, places, and businesses, corporations, that it's okay for us men to be badass. And with that, have any parting words? And we're gonna go jump off.
You bet. Well, first, any of your viewers want to connect, grab me on Facebook. I love connecting. I love sharing stories, and yeah, it's been pretty cool. Like I said, I do a lot of sales and leadership work, which is not always connected to this type of topic, but it's wonderful that I sort of blend those two in, because a lot of those principles work well in a leadership and sales role as well. So it's nice. But thank you so much for having me on. This was a wonderful conversation. I appreciate you, and I appreciate your audience, and I'm very grateful for the opportunity.
Thank you, Michael. On the last note, I've got a special show tonight on health and wellness. I've got Dr. Q. Dr. Q Collins is going to be on at 6 o'clock on the same channel. He is a scientist, a leading scientist today. He is working with people on a molecular level, people that are diagnosed with some significant chronic illnesses like cancer and diabetes and autoimmune. He himself is a student of himself. He has done long-term fasts, anywhere from 10 days to 30 days, and he actually did a 70-day fast. He's going to be on tonight at 6 p.m. to share his story and the work that he's doing to help people understand that they too have choices. As you just described, Michael, they have choices that they can opt out of traditional care, or they could do a hybrid. But he's a brilliant man. I'm excited to have him on board, especially since I'm in day 18 of my water fast. And so that's what we got for now. Hope you guys can catch us tonight. Thank you for joining us on Real Men, Real Talk Raw. And we'll see you next time, Michael. Take care.
All right. Thanks, Jay.